Sometimes you just don't want the story to end. You imagine yourself a character in the story, going along on some great adventure. You can extend that experience by playing a board game about that story. Back in the late 19th century, a lot of storybooks were being produced for kids, picture books, and a lot of the characters that we recognize even today were just taking shape back then. Not just based on Aesop's fables and Grimm's fairy tales, but also creating new characters. A lot of companies that were in that business of publishing these picture books ended up getting into the game business. Publishers such as Milton Bradley and the McLaughlin brothers also had a line of children's picture books. And so it was fairly natural to tie these together with board games and card games. Until by the early 1900s, it was pretty much expected. And of course, the Oz characters all found their way onto the game board as well. For another interesting story on the subject, check out my video about Pollyanna. Now, in 1910, a fellow named Howard R. Garris started writing little stories for the Newark Evening News. These stories were focused on a main character called Uncle Wiggily Longears and all of his woodland and fanciful friends that were anthropomorphic animal characters. For the newspaper, he wrote a little story every day except Sundays for 37 years. He also penned 79 books in his lifetime. Many of those were Uncle Wiggily books, little adventure stories that were quite similar to the barnyard cartoons that made Walt Disney famous. Several different illustrators drew Uncle Wiggily characters for the books. Probably the most famous was Lansing Campbell, and he kind of established the look of the characters for a long time. Uncle Wiggily started out as a invalid character who had a crutch. And in fact, this crutch was painted like a barber pole. Eventually, the crutch was reduced to a cane, and in some stories, he apparently had fully recovered from whatever his malady was. And of course, as with any successful franchise, Uncle Wiggily was a hot license back in the day. Tin toys, stuffed rabbits, activity books, plates and bowls, and this interesting Drawing Master pantograph kit were all available in the early days. It was in 1916 that Milton Bradley came out with the first of the Uncle Wiggily games. Curiously, though, it didn't find its way into their catalog until 1921. And the Uncle Wiggily game board changed over the years. Every 10 years or so, the artwork was refurbished and updated. The box art would have been changed. The game included little metal rabbits painted in various colors until eventually they evolved into plastic. They had a standard edition, and then they had deluxe edition, I guess. So there were two different colored boxes in some years. And I assume that means that the quality of the components was different. Pay an extra 50 cents for the metal bunnies or better cards, or I'm not sure really. I don't think I actually had Uncle Wiggily game, although it was rather ubiquitous when I was a kid. So this particular copy that I have here on the table is sort of nostalgic in an odd sort of way. This one was published in 1953. This one doesn't have any kind of little rabbits at all, but just some little discs. They may have even come from another game, I'm not sure. But there was something about this game and others of the same style that when I was a kid really confused me, because how can I be Uncle Wiggily and you can also be Uncle Wiggily? I'm the real Uncle Wiggily. How is it that we're playing the same character in the same race? Uncle Wiggily wins no matter what. Anyhow, the uncle changed over the years. He actually got younger, and then in some of the later editions, he doesn't look any older than any of the other characters in the storybooks. This is pretty typical of the board game that was designed for little kids back in the day. There's a typical track here that you follow along the trail, has numbers on it. The objective of the game is to get from Uncle Wiggily's bungalow in one corner to Dr. Possum's office in the opposite corner. His square number 151 was Dr. Possum's address in the Uncle Wiggily books. You meet some of the other characters as you go through here, and some hazards and some benefits and so on. There's 2 decks of cards here that determine the movement. And the white cards, or the pale colored cards, generally beneficial things that happen. Move ahead a particular number of spaces, or skip ahead a certain number of spaces, or go to a place that's good or bad. And occasionally it'll tell you to draw one of the red cards, and the red cards are almost invariably a bad thing, so you don't want that to happen. But sometimes they surprise you with a good thing. The design of the board is somewhat of a mystery. We've got a few spaces here that don't make a heck of a lot of sense. For example, there's this space. From here, go to number 50, but where is here? And from here, go to number 35. Well, it turns out that information is embedded in the rules on the inside of the box. There's a paragraph that tells you which space they're talking about. It seems like it would be logical to put it right on the board. You wouldn't have to continually refer back to the rule sets to remember where you're supposed to go. But despite these flaws in design as a game, the tie-in to the books kept it alive. It took on its own nostalgic value and became quite an icon in the game board industry. And it stayed in the Milton Bradley catalog until 1966. A 50-year run ain't bad. I'm sure by that time there was a combination of the popularity of the books having pretty much waned out to nothing, and competition from other games at the time that were better games. It finally did fade from view. Mr. Garris, the author of the Uncle Wiggily books, passed away in 1961, by which time the game and the books were all kind of dated. His son wrote a biography of the man in 1966, kind of a collection of his life and his works. And just coincidentally, that's the same year that Milton Bradley took the game out of their catalog. But in 1967, Parker Brothers picked up the license and produced their own version of the Uncle Wiggily game. Of course, they changed things up, and in some ways they became, again, more faithful to the original stories. In other ways, they modernized it. They shortened the game to coincide with the shorter attention span that youth had, and they produced the game for well over 20 years. Now, curiously, in 1989, both Milton Bradley and Parker Brothers published a version of the Uncle Wiggily game. I could not find a picture of that 1989 Parker version, but according to the Big Game Hunter website, the Parker version was more faithful to the original stories than the Milton Bradley version. Kind of odd, because Milton Bradley was the first company to produce a Uncle Wiggily game. And this 1989 version from Milton Bradley didn't even mention Dr. Possum, and the track ended at space number 100. Very odd kind of publication for them. Of course, as the way things went in the game industry, both Parker Brothers and Milton Bradley ended up being owned by Hasbro, and they completely eliminated the Uncle Wiggily game from their catalog at that point. But the game still is being produced. The rights were acquired by Winning Moves Company, and they produced a 100th anniversary Uncle Wiggily game back in 2016. The artwork is very much updated. Dr. Possum moved his office to square number 100. They updated the cards so that every one of them has a little rhyme to it. And it's still one of those adventurous little starter games for kids. Whether they're familiar with the character in any other way is hard to say. You don't hear too much about the Uncle Wiggily books, that's for certain. I suppose what it would take would be a full-size theatrical production. Maybe Pixar can do an Uncle Wiggily adventure, maybe not. But after 100 years, the game has outlived the popularity of the books that inspired it, and it's still with us. So if you want to play Uncle Wiggily, that's terrific. But whatever you play, be sure to play every day. Just a couple of closing notes about Uncle Wiggily, the game. In the 1952 edition, it was listed as for little folks from 4 to 10 years of age. In 1954, the age range was changed to 4 to 8 years of age. In 1962, it was between 5 and 9 years old. And in 1989, Milton Bradley set the age range 4 to 7, while the 1989 Parker version was listed as ages 5 to 11. Winning Moves has set it back to 4 to 8.